The cargo bay doors hissed open, revealing the twisted wreckage of a Vrexian scout vessel. Captain Sarah Chen stepped through the debris field, her boots crunching against shattered metal and scorched hull plating. The battle had been brief but devastating. The Vrexian Empire had attempted another raid on human mining colonies near the Outer Rim, and humanity had pushed back with their usual stubborn efficiency. Sarah's team spread out across the wreckage, scanning for survivors or salvageable technology. The Vrexians were known across the galaxy as apex predators, a race of massive reptilian warriors who had conquered 17 star systems through sheer brutality. Their empire stretched across the eastern quadrant, and every species that encountered them either submitted or died. Humans were the first to fight back and survive. A strange sound caught Sarah's attention. It was high-pitched, almost musical, but with an underlying growl that made her hand instinctively move toward her sidearm. She followed the noise through a collapsed corridor, pushing aside torn bulkheads and sparking wires. The sound grew louder, more insistent. In a small chamber that had once been crew quarters, Sarah found the source. Huddled in the corner, surrounded by the cooling bodies of adult Vrexians, was a juvenile. It couldn't have been more than a few months old, barely the size of a large dog, though Sarah knew it would eventually grow to nearly 3 meters tall. Its scales were still soft and pale, not yet hardened into the obsidian armor that made adult Vrexians nearly impervious to small arms fire. The cub stared at her with golden eyes that reflected her helmet lights. It hissed defensively, but the sound was weak, frightened. Sarah should have called her team, should have followed protocol, and eliminated a potential enemy combatant. Instead, she knelt down slowly, removing her helmet so the creature could see her face. The cub recoiled, pressing itself harder against the wall. Sarah had studied Vrexian biology during her military training. They were obligate carnivores with enhanced senses and pack-based social structures. They imprinted on their clutchmates and parents within the first few weeks of life, creating bonds that lasted until death. This one was alone now, surrounded by the bodies of its family, likely terrified and confused. Sarah reached into her emergency pack and pulled out a ration bar. It wasn't meat, but it had protein. She broke off a piece and tossed it gently toward the cub. The creature sniffed the air, its forked tongue flicking out to taste the molecules. Hunger won over fear. It darted forward, snatched the food, and retreated to its corner to devour it. Over the next hour, Sarah slowly earned the cub's trust. She moved carefully, spoke softly, and offered more food. Eventually, the juvenile allowed her to approach close enough to touch. Its scales were warm, almost feverish. Sarah ran a quick medical scan and discovered the cub was dehydrated and suffering from minor plasma burns. Without intervention, it would die within days. The decision that followed would change galactic history. Sarah smuggled the cub aboard her ship, hiding it in her personal quarters. She told no one, not even her closest friends among the crew. She knew the regulations. Vrexians were enemy combatants, regardless of age. Military law was clear, but Sarah had lost her own daughter to a Vrexian raid 3 years ago. Looking into those golden eyes, she saw not a monster, but a child who had lost everything. She named him Reek, using the rough translation of a Vrexian word she'd learned that meant survivor. The first weeks were challenging. Reek refused to eat human food, and Sarah had to sneak into the ship's cold storage to acquire raw meat. She created a small habitat in her quarters using spare cargo netting and heating elements. The cub grew quickly, doubling in size within the first month. His scales began to darken, and his juvenile teeth fell out to be replaced by the razor-sharp fangs that made Vrexians such effective predators. But something unexpected happened. Reek didn't become aggressive or territorial. He played like any young animal, pouncing on Sarah's boots when she entered the room and chittering contentedly when she scratched behind his cranial ridges. He followed her everywhere, mimicking her movements and watching her with curious, intelligent eyes. Sarah began teaching him. She showed him human writing, spoke to him constantly in both English and the guttural Vrexian language she'd learned. Reek proved remarkably intelligent, understanding commands within days and even attempting to form words despite his alien vocal structure. He learned to sit, to stay, to come when called. More importantly, he learned to trust. 3 months into their secret cohabitation, Sarah's ship received orders to dock at Firebase Prometheus for resupply and crew rotation. She couldn't leave Reek alone in her quarters for the 2 weeks they'd be in port. The risk was too great. She made a choice that would expose her secret to the one person she trusted most. Commander Marcus Webb had served with Sarah for 7 years. He'd been there when she received the news about her daughter. He'd helped her through the grief and rage that followed. When Sarah appeared at his door with a juvenile Vrexian trailing behind her, Marcus simply stared for a long moment before stepping aside to let them in. The conversation that followed was heated. Marcus pointed out the regulations, the potential court-martial, the fact that Rek was a Vrexian and would eventually become a killing machine. Sarah countered with everything she'd observed. Rek's intelligence, his capacity for learning, his gentle behavior. She argued that the Vrexian Empire's brutality might not be biological but cultural, that Rek raised outside that system might become something different. Marcus wasn't convinced, but he agreed to keep her secret. Over the following weeks, he spent time with Rek and began to see what Sarah saw. The cub was playful, affectionate, and remarkably eager to please. He learned to play fetch with a rubber ball, enjoyed having his belly rubbed, and would curl up at Sarah's feet while she worked on reports. He was, in many ways, just a child. But Reek was also undeniably a Vrexian. His strength was already formidable, his reflexes faster than any human. When Sarah accidentally cut herself on a broken panel, Reek's entire demeanor shifted. His pupils dilated, his scales flushed darker, and a deep rumble emerged from his chest. For a terrifying moment, Sarah saw the predator beneath the pet. Then Reich shook his head, as if clearing it, and gently licked the wound instead of attacking. He'd fought his instincts and won. That moment convinced Marcus completely. A Vrexian who could override predatory instincts through conscious choice was something unprecedented. Together they began documenting everything about Reich's development. They recorded his learning progress, his emotional responses, his physical capabilities. They theorized that Vrexian aggression might be learned behavior, reinforced by their brutal culture and constant warfare. Rek continued to grow. By 6 months, he was the size of an adult human, though still considered a juvenile by Vrexian standards. His scales had darkened to a deep bronze color, unusual for Vrexians who typically ranged from black to dark gray. Sarah theorized that diet and environment affected coloration. His intelligence had developed remarkably. He understood complex commands, could recognize written words, and had begun to form simple sentences in a hybrid of Vrexian growls and human phonemes. The secret couldn't last forever. During a surprise inspection by Admiral Victoria Strauss, Reek was discovered. Sarah expected immediate arrest. Instead, Admiral Strauss did something unexpected. She sat down and watched Reek for 3 hours. She observed him playing with Marcus, following Sarah's commands, and demonstrating problem-solving abilities by figuring out how to open a puzzle box designed for human children. Admiral Strauss had a reputation as a hardliner, someone who'd lost family to Vrexian aggression just like Sarah. But she was also a scientist before she was a soldier. She saw what Sarah had created, not as treason, but as opportunity. If one Vrexian could be raised to reject aggression, to value cooperation over conquest, what did that mean for the Empire's supposed biological imperative toward violence? The Admiral made a decision that would ripple across the galaxy. She authorized a classified research program, giving Sarah and Marcus official sanction to continue raising Ruck. The project was named Phoenix Protocol after the fire base where it began. The goal was simple but revolutionary: prove that Vrexian aggression was cultural, not genetic, and potentially change the course of the war. News of Phoenix Protocol eventually leaked, as all secrets do. The reaction among humans was mixed. Some saw Reek as a breakthrough, a chance for peace. Others viewed him as a monster being groomed as a weapon. Debate raged in military and civilian circles alike, but nothing compared to the reaction from the Vrexian Empire. When Vrexian intelligence learned that humans were raising one of their young, the Empire's response was immediate and visceral. They declared Sarah Chen an enemy of their entire species. They issued pronouncements calling Reek an abomination, corrupted by human influence and stripped of his true nature. They demanded his immediate return, threatening escalated military action if humans refused. But beneath the official rage was something else: fear. The Vrexian Empire's entire identity was built on the concept of biological superiority. They were predators, apex hunters, conquerors by nature. Their culture taught that dominance was genetic destiny, that their aggressive expansion was simply them claiming what evolution had intended for them. Reek's existence challenged that fundamental belief. If a Vrexian could be raised to value cooperation, empathy, and peace, then their empire's philosophy crumbled. Reek himself seemed untroubled by the controversy. He'd grown into a powerful young adult, standing over 2.5 meters tall with bronze scales that seemed to shimmer in certain lights. His physical capabilities were staggering. He could run at speeds exceeding 60 kilometers per hour, lift objects weighing several hundred kilograms, and his sensory abilities far exceeded human ranges. But he used that strength gently, mindful of his human companion's fragility. Sarah continued his education. Reek learned human history, philosophy, ethics. He studied the Vrexian Empire's conquest and expressed something that shocked everyone who heard it: shame. He was ashamed of what his species had done, of the lives taken and civilizations destroyed. He declared that he wanted to be better, to prove that Vrexians could be more than conquerors. The turning point came during a Vrexian assault on a human research station. Sarah's ship responded to the distress call, and Reek insisted on joining the defense. Military command initially refused, but Admiral Strauss overruled them. Reek was equipped with modified armor and deployed alongside human marines. When the Vrexian boarding party encountered Reek, they froze. Here was one of their own, fighting beside humans, protecting prey species from hunters. Reek didn't fight with the savage brutality typical of Vrexian warriors. He defended, disarmed, and restrained rather than kill. He spoke to the attackers in their own language, urging them to stop, to question their orders, to consider peace. Most of the Vrexian warriors couldn't process what they were seeing. Their indoctrination was too complete. But one, a young warrior named Threx, hesitated. In that hesitation, doubt took root. When the battle ended and prisoners were taken, Threx requested to speak with Reek. Their conversation lasted 6 hours and was recorded for posterity. Threx had been raised in a military creche, taught from birth that might made right and that conquest was glory. Meeting Reek shattered those certainties. Here was a Vrexian who was strong, intelligent, and capable, but who chose a different path. Threx began to question everything he'd been taught. Within weeks, he'd requested asylum among humans, becoming the first voluntary Vrexian defector in recorded history. The Empire's response was predictable: fury and increased aggression. But something had changed. Whispers began to spread through Vrexian military ranks. Rumors of the human-raised warrior who fought without killing, who showed strength through restraint rather than brutality. Young Vrexians, those not yet fully indoctrinated, began to wonder. If Rick could choose peace, could they? Sarah understood that she'd become something unprecedented in galactic history. She wasn't just a ship captain anymore. She was the human who'd raised a Vrexian, who'd proven that nature wasn't destiny. The Empire feared her not because she wielded great weapons or commanded vast fleets, but because she'd done something far more dangerous. She'd shown their youth an alternative to endless war. Years passed. Reek became an ambassador of sorts, traveling to various human colonies and allied species to demonstrate what Vrexians could be. He saved lives, protected the innocent, and spoke eloquently about the possibility of change. More Vrexians defected, seeking the chance to choose their own paths. The Empire's grip on its own people began to weaken, eroded by the simple existence of one bronze-scaled warrior who'd been shown love instead of hate. The Empire still whispered about Sarah Chen in fear, their propaganda painting her as a corrupter, a kidnapper, an enemy. But their young warriors whispered too, speaking of Rick with something that sounded dangerously like hope. And in those whispers, the seeds of revolution took root. Sarah never regretted her decision that day in the wreckage. She'd saved one life, and in doing so, perhaps saved millions more. The war wasn't over, the peace wasn't won, but the future had changed. And it had changed because one human woman had looked at a terrified cub and chosen compassion over protocol, love over hate. The galaxy would never be the same,